everyone, welcome back to PGHE. Today you're going to be learning about two of the first social theories in your social theories toolkit. These are going to be taught again by Dr. Luke Messac, who we introduced in the last session on the social determinants of health. And these first two social theories are the unintended consequences of purposive action, as well as the social construction of reality. Enjoy.
Hello again. We're back to talk about another one of our social theories. This time we're going to talk about the social construction of reality. Again, we'll start with an example. Take a look at these two photos. One, a former US President Barack Obama. The other of South African comedian Trevor Noah. And I ask, what is the race of each of these individuals? Think about that for a moment, and think about what goes into that determination. So, breaking them down one at a time, former US President Barack Obama was born in the United States, spent some time abroad as a child living in Indonesia, returned to the United States where he eventually became a politician and then president. His mother was a white person born in the United States. His father, a black person born in Kenya. And because of the history of the United States, our history of slavery and segregation, and the laws that have been passed and the judgments that have been made for our court system, traditionally anyone with a drop, what is it called, a drop of black blood, or in other words, any descendants who were seen as black are seen themselves as black. It is what's known as the one drop rule, and is a product of the particular nature of American society. So because President Obama had a black father, he was seen as black in the United States. However, Trevor Noah was born in South Africa under apartheid. And there, as he points out in his really good book, Born a Crime, to be born of a black mother and a white father had different implications under apartheid. So because of a 1927 law that forbade any sexual intercourse between Europeans and natives, again, those are social categories, Trevor Noah, when he was born, he says he was born a crime. He was born outside of the bounds of the law. To be born from a black mother and a European father was considered outside of the realms of the law. It was an illegal thing to have happened in the first place. So there wasn't really a good category or this stable category by which to define Trevor Noah. He was, in some senses, neither a European nor a native. There are other categories as well. There's a category known as colored, which Trevor Noah said people often thought he was. But the colored category in South Africa is a multi-ethnic group, but it's a group that is seen as stable, as descended from many ethnicities, but not the product of the mixing of many ethnicities in the recent past. So these two men, both born, one born of a white mother and a black father, one born of a white father and a black mother, were born in two different places, and as a result had two different labels attached to them by the societies in which they lived. So this takes us to the idea that we're going to talk about today, the social construction of reality. This is the idea that was articulated by two sociologists, Peter Berger and Thomas Luckman, in the 1960s. And the idea is that in our world, we are confronted with so many stimuli, with so many different categories, so many different things that we need to simplify. We need to put these different stimuli into categories in order to make sense of our world. And over time, groups do this together through language, through our shared understandings, and we come as societies to have these shared mental categories, these shared social constructions of reality. And over time, these constructions, these categories, these ideas of things that we group together are they become part of our everyday action. We don't have to think too much about them. Oh, that man is black. Oh, that woman is white. Right? We come to see those categories as easy to understand, and we come to understand the actions of members of a social group as falling into certain established categories. Right? This man is going to his job. A job is a social category. This man, this woman is with her family. The family, another social category, right? So most of the actions we see in everyday life, we can understand through these categories. That's called reciprocal typification in Berger and Luckman's language. It's less important to understand exactly these terms, but try to focus on what the social construction of reality means. And how does this work, right? How do we get these categories in the first place? How do some people come to be understood as black and others as white? Well, Peter Berger and Thomas Luckman say that it's through conversation. We talk with each other, we write to each other, we have judicial rulings and laws. This is all different ways of human beings sharing language with one another. And in sharing language with one another, we come to have these shared understandings, these shared social constructions. And importantly, over time, these social constructions come to be seen as natural, as inevitable, right? So it's just one way of organizing the world, right? There's so many stimuli. We come to put everything into certain categories, certain boxes through conversation with each other. But we could have organized it another way, right? The United States organized racial categories with the one-drop rule. The apartheid South Africa organized it in a different way based on the history of colonization and apartheid. Who's to say that one is more natural than another? Both of them have changed fairly recently with the end of apartheid in South Africa and the civil rights movement in the United States. So it's hard to say when we really look at them that either one of them is natural. But Berger and Luckman say that in our lives, when we have these social constructions, they come and eventually to be seen by people who use them as natural, as inevitable. We use them every day. They're part of our lives. We forget where they came from, and we just see them as inevitable features of our everyday lives. And finally, there is a way that these are protected. And fields of study in the ways that we are educated in schools and in our homes and in our churches and in our lives. This is called legitimation. These social categories are protected by these fields of knowledge, right? By study, by religion, by family life. All of these things come to protect and legitimate and make these social categories seem inevitable. However, They can be disrupted. They can be changed. These social constructions are very powerful, but they are not unbreakable. They can be changed. A similar discussion of social construction is had in a more recent book by a sociologist named Gergen, and he talks a little bit more about what this means. So he says the terms in which the world is understood are social artifacts, products of historically situated interchanges among people. He's saying the same thing as Berger and Luckman are saying, right? We understand the way that we understand the world, right? Who is white, who is black, who is colored in South Africa, it is a product of history. It comes about because of the way that people organized society and understood one another in the past. And the degree to which a given form of understanding prevails or is sustained across time is not fundamentally dependent on the empirical validity of the perspective in question, right? It's not necessarily a product of fact, of truth, of the inevitable reality, but on the vicissitudes of social processes. That just means the way that we understand these social categories happens because of the way we interact with each other, not necessarily because of deep, rigorous scientific study of the reality of a thing. Right? And then our behavior maintains what we have learned through past experience and helps create a world consistent with our reality. So we come to behave in a way that maintains these social categories, that maintains these social constructions. So what does this mean for global health? Why are we talking about this? Well, in global health, we are confronted with so many stimuli, with so much data, with so much information, and in so many places, so many different societies and times. And we are asked, or we have given ourselves the responsibility of making some sense of it, of putting these varied stimuli and problems into categories, right? Diseases and responses and goals, right? All of these things are social constructions that we have created in our field. And so this says, though many of the major constructions used by global health practitioners are quite historically and culturally specific, they can be universalized and shape policies. That means that many times society has, or different global health practitioners have taken things that are very specific to one group, maybe one culture, maybe one society, maybe one country, and made it into a universal category. And we'll talk a little bit about that when we get to the GDP, when we talk about GDP in just a moment. And the other thing is that social constructions are subject to change. They can be changed, right? Berger and Luckman said that these are powerful categories, but they can be changed. So let's think about race one more time. As we were discussing, the social construction of race, right? Who is white, who is black, who is a native, who is a European, all these things. These come about in our conversations in everyday life, and then they become habitualized through discrimination and segregation. And then reciprocal typification. Remember this term that Berger and Luckman used to describe the way that things come to seem, we organize our lives, we organize everything we see into these categories, right? That happens through stereotyping, right? We see the actions of a white person and the actions of a black person, or the dress of a white person, the dress of a black person as fitting a stereotype. And it all comes to make sense, right? We do the same thing, perhaps, with men and women, or with other social categories. So these stereotypes help people to understand the world around them. And then in the case of race, there are scientific fields, there are fields of study that are used to make this way of categorizing the world seem inevitable, seem natural. And in the case of race, one of those fields is scientific racism, which for centuries was used to justify the subjugation of Black people in society in the United States and in Africa. So these different processes of social construction can help us understand what is going on when we talk about race and why it is different in two different places. And when we think about medicine, we want to think clearly about that, because sometimes in medicine we've maybe even more recently been taught that there are differences in the ways we should treat Black people and white people. And there has been a movement against that in recent years, a movement to break that social construction. And one of the papers that recently came out to break that social construction came out in a journal called Science, one of the foremost journals in scientific study, in 2016. And the authors there noted that even between Africa and Europe, there is not a single absolute genetic difference, meaning no single variant where all Africans have one variant and all Europeans another one. So there's no single genetic basis for this supposed difference between Africans and Europeans. There's so much variety within African populations, genetic variety, and so much within European populations. And you can't find one thing that separates Africans and Europeans. So let's move on to a different social construction. And this one is also very important in global health. And this is the disability adjusted life year. So you might have talked about this already in a previous lecture, but if you haven't, in brief, the disability adjusted life year is a way that disease burdens are measured in a population, in a country. And what it is it takes a disease and it says how many years of life have been lost to this disease, right? If you were supposed to live to 65 and instead breast cancer struck you down and took your life at age 45, you have lost 20 years of life due to that disease. But it also says years of life with disability, right? How many years did you live with this disability? Perhaps breast cancer left you with some complication that you were unable to live your life fully, and you live with that for the last 10 years of your life. So that's 10 years with disability. And then that years with disability is multiplied by a disability weight. So, and we'll get into this in a second, but the disability weight has to do with how disabled you were by this calculation. So if your disability weight is 0.5, then you multiply 10 by 0.5, you get 5. So you have 5 years of life lost to disability. So you've lost 20 years of life because you died early, you lost 5 years due to the disability, you lost 25 years of disability adjusted life years in this case. That's just a hypothetical scenario, but as you'll see in this course, the disability adjusted life year, the DALY, is a very important, very commonly used measure of disease burden. And so the people who designed the disability adjusted life year, they're scholars. They're Christopher Murray, currently at the University of Washington, who receives a lot of funding from the Gates Foundation. And he designed this measure, and he wanted to translate years lived with disability into an equivalent time to years of life lost, right? So he wanted one measure, one number that combined both the number of years you lost in your life to the number of years you lived with a disability. And he wanted to collapse that into a single number. And he did that by using these disability weights. And the disability weights is supposed to reflect a reduction in your functional capacity. your ability to learn, work, feed, and clothe yourself. Basically, how productive, how useful, how functional are you? That helped determine the disability weight. So say you were living with a disease that didn't cause you to lose those capacities. You could still learn, work, feed, and clothe yourself. Your disability weight during those years of life would be very low, but if you were incapacitated by a disease that didn't allow you to do those things, then your disability weight would be very high. So this is a way to measure disease burden, a specific way to measure disease burden. He also made other assumptions when he created the DALY. So one of the things he did was he wanted to he said that because you are more productive, because you are more useful and able to do these things like work, feed, clothe yourself when you are in your 20s than say when you're a young child, then those years in your 20s are actually by this measure valued more than the years that you're very young. And so if a 3-year-old loses her life, that might actually result in less DALYs lost than if a 20-year-old loses her life. So again, the calculations are more involved than this, but the point is that this is a very specific way of organizing disability adjusted life years, or organizing measures of disease burden. You could imagine a number of ways that you could have organized measures of disease burden that were different than this. Perhaps simply mortality rates would have been one way, but this is a different way that became very popular. Sudhir Anand and Kara Hansen, who are noted at the bottom here, wrote an article that's very helpful in the Journal of Health Economics in 1997 that was a critical review of the disability adjusted life years. And it goes through some of these issues and criticizes or critiques them and says, is this really the way that we want to measure disease burden around the globe? Do we want to live with this one measure? Another way, another social construction that has become very important is GDP, or gross domestic product. And that is the way that we measure aggregate production in a country. And it is also seen, or has become seen, as an overall measure of welfare, of human welfare. Especially GDP per capita is often taken as a very important measure, maybe the singularly important measure of human welfare in a country. And because of that, a number of things have happened. And one of them is that this measure of welfare has, in some cases, overtaken things like mortality in the discussion of what we are trying to pursue, what we are trying to maximize and minimize. So let me give you an example. In 2005, an economist named Alwyn Young wrote a paper, a very widely cited paper in the Quarterly Journal of Economics. It's a very important journal in economics. And he wrote a paper called The Gift of the Dying. Now, the idea in this paper was that South Africa's AIDS epidemic would result in a higher GDP per capita in the future than if South Africa had had no AIDS epidemic at all. Now, he made a number of assumptions when he said this. One of them, probably the most important one, was that the AIDS epidemic would lead to a decline in fertility, that women would have fewer children because they were afraid of contracting AIDS, or because they pursued work more frequently than child rearing. But in any case, that was one of his major assumptions. Because of that assumption of decreased fertility, he went on to extrapolate that productivity would increase, that wages would increase, and that eventually South Africa would have a higher GDP per capita with an AIDS epidemic, with a very deadly AIDS epidemic, than if it had not had a deadly AIDS epidemic. So one of the quotes from here is, I find it, this is from his paper, I find that even with extremely pessimistic assumptions concerning reductions in educational attainment, right? He says maybe people will get less education if there's so many teachers dying. The fertility effect dominates, right? The idea that women will have fewer babies, that dominates. The AIDS epidemic enhances the future per capita consumption possibilities of the South African economy, in effect endowing it with additional resources. So this is a very, in some ways, strange way of talking about the AIDS epidemic in South Africa, of saying that, well, one of the things we should know about the AIDS epidemic, or one of the things we should expect about the AIDS epidemic in South Africa, is that it will increase GDP per capita in the long run. And there's a number of reasons to criticize Alan Wynne Young's paper on its methods, right? Is it true that the AIDS epidemic will result in a higher GDP per capita in the future? Is it true that women will have fewer babies in the setting of an AIDS epidemic than in the absence of an AIDS epidemic? Those are things that could be argued and have been argued. But let's say, for sake of argument, that it is true. Well, so what, right? People are dying of AIDS, and they are dying needlessly. There's treatment to save them from AIDS. We know how to treat HIV with antiretroviral drugs. So why are we so interested in this question of GDP per capita when we could be focused on mortality? Dr. Young, or Professor Young, says in his paper, the reason why he's focused on GDP per capita is that there is a long-standing emphasis on GDP per capita in the economics profession as a measure of economic well-being, right? We could be focused on mortality in this paper, but we're focused on GDP per capita because the economics profession sees it as a measure of economic well-being. So we're going to focus on this measure. And that's kind of a very, one of the clearest statements of the social construction of reality that you can have, right? Our profession, our group of people that talk to each other, has made this one category, GDP, gross domestic product, aggregate production, the measure of welfare that we want to focus on. And for that reason, I will write this paper that says that the AIDS epidemic will be a gift of the dying to the living. So where did this come from? Where did this GDP per capita even come from? And I think by looking at this, by looking at the history of the GDP per capita, or GDP, we can see where the social construction comes from, right? We can see that the GDP is not inevitable as the major measure of welfare. It is just one way of understanding the world. And it was created by specific people for specific purposes. So I want to take you back to Malawi in the 1930s. And back then, Malawi in East Africa was then a British colony known as Nyasaland. And it was a colony of the British, and the British wanted to organize a survey of nutrition. There were a few researchers who wanted to study nutrition in villages in Malawi. So they went there, they asked everyone what they were eating, how often they were eating it, they measured the calorie content of their food, they weighed the food, and they saw how much people were eating every month. And you'll see they measured calorie requirements, they estimated calorie requirements in the population, how much should people be eating, how much were they eating, and then this third column is a percent difference, or percent surplus rather. So in December, you'll see the percent surplus was negative 5.1. That means that people were consuming as they measured it, 5% fewer calories than they needed it. In January, it was even worse, right? 28% fewer calories than they needed. In some months like July after the harvest, people would eat more than they needed. So this was one way of understanding welfare in these villages, right? How many calories do people in a given village need? How much are they eating? And what is the difference? That's one measure, and that's the measure of welfare that these researchers chose to highlight in their paper. So a few years later, also in Britain, so back in the UK now, a few researchers named James Mead and Richard Stone, two economists, decided that they needed a different measure of production, not agricultural production per se, but overall production. They were writing this at the beginning of World War II. The UK had just entered the war and needed to increase its production of ships, of guns, of material to fight the Germans in Europe. So they said, well, let us measure how much we're producing. And we're going to measure not in specific villages or not of specific foods, but we're going to measure overall production in the whole of society. And they devised their own method of doing this. I'm not going into the details of Table A, but this is the measure that they described of what they call the national income. Not the income of specific people, but the income of a nation. And they thought that this was very important to understand and to try to increase in order to win the war. In order to win the war, you had to increase production. So we're going to measure production. We're going to see where we're going wrong. We're going to see what we need to increase. And we're going to increase production as fast as we can to help with the war effort. So in doing this, actually, they wanted also to study the colonies. So Mead and Stone hired Phyllis Dean, a young researcher at that time. She was then 23. This is a picture of Miss Dean when she became, Professor Dean, when she became much older. But they hired her to go back to Malawi and study the national income of Malawi, which was a British colony. They thought, well, we have these colonies, we should increase their production as well for the war effort. So they wanted to understand how to measure production in Malawi. And so Ms. Dean, or then Ms. Dean, later Professor Dean, she studied production in Malawi, but she was a little confused, right? Because in the UK, you could study things quite easily. You could study how much milk have we made and how much does it sell for? How much steel have we made and how much does it sell for? And you could use that to measure the national income. But in colonial Africa, in rural Africa, she said that it was very difficult because much of the production was not ever done for sale, right? Many African women were involved in cultivating the soil and grinding the corn and cooking and preparing the food and collecting firewood and wild foods. And they never sold it. They used it in their own homes for their own families. And so how were those to be measured? How were those to be given prices? How were those to be included in a single measure of national income? So she wondered about how to do this. Eventually, she came up with her own methods of doing it in order to fit into Mead and Stone's system, right, into their social construction. And interestingly, one of the measures that she used of production were those studies that were done a few years before by the nutrition researchers, right? So she took the nutrition research, which was done to show when in the year people were hungry, and she used it instead to show the aggregate level of production, how much production is done in total. She was less interested in this study for which months are they hungry, which months are they not hungry, who's hungry, who's full. She was interested in how much are they producing as a whole. And that's important, right? This focus changing from individual welfare or welfare over time to just this single unit of measure of welfare, the national income, the GDP, became the gross domestic product. Once that became the single measure of welfare, then all sorts of other things fall away. These questions, who's hungry? It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if a few people are hungry in your society or a lot of people are hungry in your society if you have all of this production, right? If your GDP is high, then you can say we are succeeding by that measure, even if you forget all of the other things that are going on underneath. So this is seen in these quotes. I'll read one of them. Simplest indicator of economic progress of a community is the movement of real income per head of the population, right? That statement became the social construction accepted by economists, by development experts for decades. And even by many African politicians and African leaders. Julius Nyerere, an African socialist, he said in 1968, we have to increase our production of goods if we are to enable everyone to live in conditions of human dignity. He says wealth, the production of wealth is not for its own sake is not a socialist purpose, right? He admits that in his system, producing wealth is not the ultimate goal. But he, like Derek Blades, like Tom Boya, they are saying we have to increase production. That has to be our primary goal right now. Eventually, some economists would say that this was a bad way of looking at things, that this was an incomplete way of looking at things. Dudley Sears said that economic growth and social development are not the same, right? Economic growth by GDP per capita cannot be our only measure of human welfare. We have to look at poverty, unemployment, we have to look at inequality. These things are also important. Marilyn Waring, who is an economist from New Zealand, stated that, well, GDP includes things like weapons production, it includes things like cutting down our forests, and it doesn't include things like caring for our children, which isn't paid. So are we really measuring human welfare when we say that we just want to maximize GDP? If we want to maximize weapons production and cutting down forests and minimize or not focus on the care of our children, right? These things should not be our measure of welfare, according to Marilyn Waring. So eventually, this critique of the dominance of GDP, of this social construction of GDP as natural, as the only measure of welfare, came to be overturned in a sense, in a small way, with the Human Development Index, which the United Nations took up in the 1990s. And it was designed by Mahbub ul Haq, who you'll see at the top here, and also under the influence, with the help of Amartya Sen, an economist. And this was a measure not only of per capita income, but it included school enrollment, adult literacy, and life expectancy. And it said, well, if you really want to measure human welfare, if you really want to measure human development, you will include more than per capita income. You will include life expectancy. You will include adult literacy. You will include school enrollment. So now you can find the rankings of countries by Human Development Index. And you'll see that those rankings are different than the rankings of per capita income. And Professor Sen, Amartya Sen, who you saw in the previous slide, he noted this. He said, well, look at the difference between life expectancy in a country and the GDP per capita in a country. So he looked at China in the second column here. He looked at Sri Lanka, South Africa, Brazil, Gabon, and the first one is the Indian state of Kerala, which is a state that he focuses on a lot because it is a state with very egalitarian policies that focus on equality. And you'll note that GNP, or gross national product, slightly different than gross domestic product, but for our cases, equivalent. GNP per capita on the left and years of life expectancy on the right can vary wildly between these countries. So Kerala is relatively poor. Its GNP per capita in 1992 was only $300 US, whereas its life expectancy was 71 years. Whereas Gabon, which has a lot of oil wealth, but not a lot of egalitarian or policies focused on equity, has a very high, by comparison, GNP per capita, $4,400, but a very low, by comparison, life expectancy, 54 years. So Sen said in this paper, why don't we focus on mortality as our measure of economic success? Why are we focusing on GNP per capita as our measure of economic success? By that measure, Gabon is doing better than Kerala. Gabon is doing better than China. Gabon is doing better than Sri Lanka. But its people live much shorter than the people in those countries. So we should be focusing on mortality. That is another thing that we should be focusing on, not just GNP per capita. So why did I tell you that whole story? The story that started with nutrition researchers in Malawi in the 1930s and came up to the 1990s with the Human Development Index and this paper by Amartya Sen. It is to show you that over time, GDP was created first as a measure of production in wartime, right? And then it became a measure of overall economic welfare, one that was very powerful. It became habitualized, it became accepted by many as natural and intuitive. Of course, we'll measure human welfare with the GDP per capita, right? That is the natural way to see things. That is the natural way to rank countries, to rank societies, to rank our progress, to measure our progress towards development. And it changed the world around us because policies were developed that were intended to maximize GDP growth. I'm sure you guys will discuss this in future classes. But when we get to the 1980s, we'll talk about austerity policies that were put in place in order to maximize GDP per capita, right? The 1960s had a similar set of policies, or not the same set of policies, but the same goal of maximizing GDP per capita. So this measure, this social construction, had very powerful effects. But it was changed over time. New generations of economists did challenge it and did say that other things should be measured as measures of human welfare. Still, though, GDP was so central to our understanding of economic welfare that the major journal of economics, the Quarterly Journal of Economics, could publish this paper, The Gift of the Dying, that we talked about earlier by Dr. Young, where he said, right, in his title, The Gift of the Dying, that the AIDS epidemic would be a gift because it would increase GDP per capita in the future, right? That is a very specific way of understanding the world, of understanding human welfare, and it comes from this history. It is not natural, it is not inevitable, it is a product of the way that certain people talk to each other over time. That is the social construction of reality. So, thank you again for taking the time to chat with me about this, and I look forward to talking with you again soon.